So, basically you're saying that you want to put into law, for example, perhaps as an amendment to Section 230 or somewhere else, that transparency around these 10 databases as a starting point, right? And so tell me a little bit about, pick a few that you think are the most important and tell me about them and why that would make a significant difference.
So one of them is a data set about what their algorithms are, making go viral. So rewind the clock. The most famous example of all of this was, the Ferguson protests. So on Twitter, all you saw were the Ferguson protests. On Facebook, all you saw were happy, smiley people dumping buckets of ice water over their heads as part of the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Two polar different universes. That wasn't because the people on Facebook didn't care or vice versa. It was because of how their systems were designed. Facebook's algorithms decided, either on their own or through human intervention, to prioritize happy, smiley, friendly things at that point. And so that's kind of the case, that's the example that's always given of the power of these algorithms. And you think about today, let's say some lawmaker puts forward a policy proposal and it's a dud. Nobody cares about it. Nobody talks about it on social media. Nobody discusses it. They don't hear from any of their constituents. That might, cause them to think, well, maybe this is not a useful policy proposal. But maybe that's because the algorithms decided that that's a bad policy proposal and made sure that no one actually saw that proposal out there. So again, like having this visibility, what are these algorithms feeding us? So, last week, the Facebook whistleblower saying that Facebook's algorithms, they're either directly or inadvertently are designed to push us towards angry, rage, divisive content. And Facebook, of course, responded and said, absolutely not. That's completely false. The problem is that, at this point, we don't have the data. We can't answer who's right, who is correct there. If you actually had a list, so one of that would be a list, what is the type of content that they are prioritizing? What are their algorithms putting forward? And on a public platform like Twitter, that's very easy. You could say on Facebook, there's all kinds of privacy issues there. On Twitter, everything's public anyway. And so it's very easy to put that forward and just, show that. I think another interesting data set here is, you think about when a celebrity gets their tweet deleted, we read about it in the news media because they have that outlet. They can go public about it. An ordinary person doesn't really have an easy outlet to get attention. So we don't really know, how often is content pulled down every day? I mean, the only way we see this is, quarterly reports where they might say, we took down 1 billion pieces of content. But, that's just a statistic, who was behind that content? So even things like demographic, we picture kind of the stereotype, this caricature of, the person on, social media putting out something bad and getting it removed. But is that really true? Who are the people that are affected? For example, hate speech rules. We see that, we sort of picture, the KKK member there, but is it actually affecting other people? And we saw this actually played out in a very interesting case. So Facebook has the oversight board, their quote unquote Supreme Court of Facebook. And it was very interesting. There's a case where they ruled, it was actually in Myanmar, where there was a case where someone made some comments about Muslims and, said, I forget the specific quote, but something, I think the quote was, there's something psychologically wrong with Muslims was the quote. And so Facebook took that down and said, well, and there was some other stuff in there. Facebook took it down and said, this is an attack on a specific ethnicity. The oversight board ordered them to put it back and said that, yes, it is an attack on them. Yes, this is a country where there's, actually genocide, against this particular group. But I think their argument was that it was a sort of academic scholarly discussion about this. And so this becomes very interesting where you can say, well, even something that, you and I might say, well, somebody saying something like that, under Facebook's rules, that would seem to be a pretty clear, violation of their rules, but yet their own oversight board says, that's actually not a violation. And you look through their cases, it really reminds you that, there's such a, that even things that seem really clear cut, suddenly, if you look at it from that perspective, it's a really complicated world. So for me, where I think something that's missing here is a public database of what's coming down. So look at Twitter. On Twitter, there is a third party called PolitiWhoops, where they basically archive tweets from politicians that those politicians eventually delete. So that's a well-known site. It's really useful to kind of see what are people saying and they had second thoughts on. The problem is PolitiWhoops only archives that this tweet was published and then removed. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe they misspelled someone's name. They reposted immediately with the correct one. It doesn't archive why that tweet was removed. And this is important because when Twitter says that something's a violation of their rules, they don't typically remove the content themselves. They suspend your account and say you're suspended until you remove the content. So it's hard to tell from the outside. You just see a tweet disappeared. You have no idea why. And because everything's public on Twitter, it would be very easy for Twitter, for example, every tweet that gets removed to provide that explanation. Why was this removed? And the counter argument to that, of course, would be, well, if you produce this archive full of all this material, isn't that going to be basically an archive of horrible stuff? Well, there's another website called Lumen. And what it is it basically archives copyright takedown requests. So if someone posts, an illegal copy of the newest, Top Gun movie, and they publish it on, some website, and, that website deletes it and says it's a copyright infringement, that goes on this website called Lumen. Now, that doesn't give the original URL, it doesn't give the details. It just says, hey, there was a copy of this, it was removed because of the following reasons. Researchers and journalists can get additional access that gives them a little bit more information on that. And because of that, so in other words, you're able to sort of archive this information without, without sort of creating an archive of links that people can follow. And you think about Twitter, what about the same model for Twitter? What if any tweet that Twitter deletes has to go in this permanent archive? And let's say that you are someone on Twitter, your tweet gets deleted. Now, imagine if Twitter is required to ask you, hey, here's the following demographics that we have that either you've told us about, maybe you have it in your bio, or that we've inferred about you through our algorithms. We've determined something about you. Now, you might say, hey, this is sensitive information. Like maybe it says, hey, you're LGBTQ, or you're this, or you're that. And you say, I don't really want that public. You might choose not to. Or you might say, hey, you know what? I want that in there. So now you can start saying, hey, guess what? The hate speech rules are, 90% of the tweets being deleted are actually LGBTQ people. Hey, that's a bad situation here. That means we need to tweak these algorithms. So like having that type of demographic data attached to these, allows us to really understand or take fact checks. If you take think about like Facebook today, they remove content based on fact checks. What are the top fact checks that are result in the most takedowns? If I take all the climate change coverage in a given day that's deleted, is there one fact check that kind of resulted in all that? Are there multiple fact checks? This kind of tells us like who are the sort of the sources of truth that are defining what's out there today. And that's useful to fact checkers as well, because if they say, hey, for every climate change piece that gets taken down, there's one fact check basically that's resulting in all this. That might be something to look back at. Same thing in the early days of COVID. Facebook banned any post by an individual that said, hey, I had an adverse reaction to the vaccine. Those were largely banned on their platform. And then, of course, you had the blood clot, and once that was documented, then they had to go back and alter those rules to specifically exempt blood clots. Now, again, that was a case where I asked, well, how many people were reporting blood clots before that point? Had that not been banned, could that have been an early warning indicator that could have helped doctors early on? Same thing with masks. In the early days of the pandemic, remember, it was the official guidance not to wear a mask. And so I've asked, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, I've said, your rules say any post that disagrees with public health authorities is removed. What would you have done in the early days of the pandemic when, most of the world was saying wear a mask? The public health authorities here were saying don't wear a mask. What would you do there? And the answer, I think, was Facebook that actually said, well, A, it's a hypothetical, but B, what I thought was very interesting, they said, this is one of the reasons that we say that governments should really step in here. We shouldn't be the ones making the decisions about what should be posted or not posted. The government, this is really interesting. This is Facebook saying this, that, governments really need to step in and tell us what to remove, because if people are upset about this, then, really, in the absence of anything, we're the ones having to make these decisions. And I thought, that's a really truthful statement, essentially, that, so much of this, again, comes back to that fact that they're basically kind of left to their own devices there.